The rain in Oakhaven didn't wash things clean. It just turned the city's secrets into a gray-smelling sludge that clung to the wheel wells of Detective Elena Vance's rusted sedan. She pulled up to the iron gates of the Blackwood Estate, the engine coughing a final, metallic protest before dying. For 3 years, the file on Sarah Miller had gathered dust, a wild animal attack that the coroner had signed off on with suspicious haste. But Elena had spent those 3 years looking at the photos of the jagged, systematic lacerations that no wolf or bear could produce. They were too precise, too rhythmic. They were a message written in bone. She stepped out into the downpour, her trench coat soaking through instantly. The house sat atop the hill like a gargoyle, all jagged Victorian edges and dark windows. This was the home of Silas Vane, the man the local police whispered about, with a reverence that tasted like fear. He was the alpha of the town's most powerful family, a dynasty that owned the lumber mills, the land, and, if the rumors were true, the very shadows between the trees. Elena pressed the buzzer. She didn't have a warrant, just a cold case file and a gut feeling that was currently screaming at her to run. The gates groaned open with a motorized hum. Elena drove up the winding path, the headlights cutting through the fog to reveal ancient oaks that seemed to lean in, listening. When she reached the porch, the door was already open. Silas Vane stood in the threshold. He wasn't the hulking beast the tabloids hinted at. He was lean, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's annual salary, with eyes the color of flint. The air around him felt heavy, vibrating with an energy that made the hair on Elena's arms stand up. It wasn't just power. It was a physical presence, a heat that defied the freezing rain. "Detective Vance," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and settle in her chest. "The police haven't knocked on this door in a decade. I assume you aren't here for a donation to the PBA." "I'm here about Sarah Miller, Mr. Vane," Elena replied, flashing her badge briefly before tucking it away. She stepped into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. The interior was all dark wood and the scent of cedar and expensive bourbon. 3 years ago she was found 2 miles from your property line. The report said a mountain lion. I've spent the last 48 hours looking at mountain lion attacks from the last 50 years. None of them look like what happened to Sarah. Silas closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the cavernous space. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "And what do you think happened to her, Detective? You've come a long way for a closed case." "I think she stumbled into something she wasn't supposed to see," Elena said, moving deeper into the room, her boots clicking on the marble. "I think the animal attack was a cover-up for something much more human. Or maybe something that just wants us to think it's human. There's a war happening in these woods, Silas. I see the signs, the missing hikers, the burnt-out cabins, the way the local sheriff turns white when I mention your name. I'm not here to play games. I'm here because Sarah Miller deserved better than a lie." Silas walked toward her, his movements fluid and unnervingly quiet. He stopped just inches away, his height forcing her to look up. He smelled of rain and something wilder, musk and ozone. "You're remarkably brave, Elena. Or remarkably stupid. Do you have any idea whose doorstep you're standing on?" "I'm standing on the doorstep of a man who knows exactly who killed that girl," she snapped, refusing to flinch. "And I'm not leaving until I get a name." Silas leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The name you're looking for isn't in a police database. The world is much older and much bloodier than your textbooks suggest. Sarah Miller didn't die because of a war. She died because she saw a predator that didn't want to be seen. If you keep digging, you'll find him. But you won't like what happens when he finds you back." The air in the room suddenly felt electric, a storm brewing within the 4 walls. Elena felt a strange pull, a magnetic attraction to the danger radiating off the man in front of her. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was an invitation into a world of shadows. Silas reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her dampened hair, before he pulled back. Go home, Detective, he said, his eyes flashing a momentary predatory gold. Before the woods decide you're part of the hunt. Elena didn't move. She pulled a crime scene photo from her pocket, the one showing a strange, runic symbol carved into a tree near Sarah's body. She held it up to him. This symbol. It's appeared again. 2 nights ago at the old mill. Another animal attack. If you won't help me stop this, then you're just as guilty as the one who did it. Silas stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. The cool mask of the aristocrat slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a raw, ancient anger. That mark, that's not mine. I know, Elena said softly. That's why I'm here. You're the alpha, aren't you? Someone is hunting in your territory, Silas. And they're leaving a trail of bodies to lead me straight to you. Silas took the photo from her hand, his grip crushing the paper. The realization hit him. The detective wasn't just an investigator. She was the bait, and someone had played them both. Keep your gun close, Elena, he muttered, his voice thick with a sudden dark protectiveness. The slow burn of this mystery just turned into a wildfire, and we're right in the center of the brush. The rain outside intensified, ease hammering against the mansion like 1,000 fists as the detective and the wolf realized that the real monster was already inside the gates. The cold case wasn't just opening, it was beginning to bleed. Elena looked into Silas's eyes and saw the monster he kept caged, but for the first time in her career, she wasn't afraid of the beast. She was afraid of the man who knew exactly how the story ended. I'm not going home, Elena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. I'm staying until we find them. Silas gave a grim, sharp smile. Then welcome to the pack, Detective. Try not to get eaten. The investigation began in earnest that night, under the flickering light of Silas's library. They pored over maps of the Blackwood territory. Were Elena's methodical police work clashing, and then clicking with Silas's ancestral knowledge of the land? She showed him the patterns she'd mapped out. The kills weren't random. They were a perimeter, a ritualistic circle being drawn around the Vane estate. Each victim was a specific type, young, healthy, and always found near water. Silas explained the lore she'd only glimpsed in fever dreams. He spoke of the Ferali, outcasts from the pack who had lost their humanity to the moon, becoming nothing more than hunger and instinct. But this was different. This was organized. Someone was directing the hunger. As the hours bled into the early morning, the tension between them shifted. It was no longer just the friction of an interrogation. It was the heat of 2 people realizing they were the only ones who could see the truth. Elena watched Silas as he moved, his grace nearly hypnotic. He was a creature of violence, she knew that. Yet there was a deep-seated honor in him, a protective streak that extended to every person in this town, whether they knew it or not. Why do you stay? She asked, looking up from a topographical map. You could be anywhere. You have the money, the power. Why stay in a town that fears you? Silas paused, his hand resting on the back of a leather chair. Because the shadows here need a master, Elena. If I leave, the things that live in the dark won't have a leash. Someone has to be the monster that keeps the other monsters away. That's a lonely way to live, she said. It was, he replied, his gaze locking onto hers. Until a detective decided to kick down my door. The moment was broken by a low, guttural howl that ripped through the silence of the house. It wasn't the sound of a wolf. It was a distorted, screaming wail that sounded like metal grinding on bone. It came from the woods, just beyond the lawn. Silas was at the window in a heartbeat. They're here. He didn't grab a gun. He shed his jacket, his muscles rippling beneath his shirt. Elena drew her service weapon, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. How many? Too many for you, Silas said, turning to her. Stay in the house. The silver plating in the walls will keep them out. Like hell, Elena said, checking her magazine. I've spent 3 years chasing this. I'm not sitting in the kitchen while you settle the score. Silas looked at her, a mixture of exasperation and something that looked dangerously like admiration crossing his face. If you die, I'm going to be very annoyed. Duly noted. They stepped out onto the porch together. The fog had rolled in thick, a white wall that hid the tree line. From the mist, shapes began to emerge. They were twisted versions of wolves, elongated limbs, mangy fur, and eyes that glowed with a sickly, necrotic green light. They weren't the noble creatures Silas represented. They were the rot of the supernatural world. At the center of the circle stood a man Elena recognized. It was Deputy Miller, Sarah's brother. But he wasn't the grieving sibling she'd interviewed 6 months ago. His skin was gray, his veins black and bulging. In his hand, he held a jagged ritual dagger. "You let her die, Silas," Miller screamed, his voice cracking with a supernatural distortion. "You were the Alpha! You were supposed to protect the town! But you just hid in your castle while the hunger took her." "I didn't kill her, Miller," Silas roared, his voice deepening, his shoulders broadening as the transformation began to pull at his frame. "The Ferali took her. I hunted them down for it. I ended them." "You didn't end the hunger." Miller laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "The shadows gave me a gift. They showed me that if I can't have my sister back, I can make this whole town feel what she felt. I can make you bleed for your silence." Miller gestured, and the twisted creatures lunged. The next few minutes were a blur of silver muzzle flashes and the terrifying sound of rending flesh. Elena fired with a precision born of years on the range, her bullets finding the eyes and hearts of the creatures. They didn't die easily, but the silver-tipped rounds she'd requisitioned on a hunch did their work. Beside her, Silas was a whirlwind of shadow and tooth. He had shifted, not into a full wolf, but into something in between, a towering warrior of fur and muscle. He moved with a speed no human could track, tearing through the pack with a feral grace that was as beautiful as it was horrific. Elena felt a claw rake across her shoulder, the pain searing like a brand. She spun, dumping 3 rounds into the chest of a creature that looked like it had been stitched together from nightmares. She backed up against the porch railing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Elena!" Silas shouted, his voice a bark of command. He vaulted over a stone planter, landing between her and 2 lunging attackers. He swiped them aside like they were made of straw, his eyes glowing with an intense golden fire. He turned to her, checking for damage, his clawed hand hovering near her wounded shoulder. Even in this state, the connection was there, a tether of mutual survival. Miller watched from the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide with a manic light. "You can't stop the rot, Silas. It's in the soil. It's in the blood." He raised the dagger to his own throat, a final sacrifice to fuel the darkness he'd unleashed. "No!" Elena yelled, but she was too far. Before Miller could strike, a shot rang out. Not from Elena's gun, but from the tree line. A second group of hunters emerged, men and women in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind gas masks. They moved with military precision, firing tranquilizer darts and flashbangs that sent the remaining creatures scattering into the dark. Silas snarled, shielding Elena with his body as the newcomers surrounded the porch. "Stand down, Vane," a voice boomed from a megaphone. "Department of Paranormal Oversight. We've been tracking this cell for months. You're interfering with a federal investigation." Silas shifted back, his skin steaming in the cold air as his human form returned. He stood tall, naked, and unashamed, his gaze fixed on the lead agent. "You're late, and you're on my land." The agents ignored him, moving to secure Miller, who was sobbing in the dirt, the ritual dagger kicked away. Elena felt the adrenaline begin to ebb, replaced by a crushing exhaustion and the throbbing pain in her shoulder. She slid down the wall, her gun heavy in her hand. Silas was at her side in an instant, wrapping his discarded suit jacket around her. "You're bleeding." "I've had worse," she lied, her voice shaking. He looked at her, the golden glow fading from his eyes, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. "You found your answer, Detective. It wasn't a war. It was a tragedy." "It's never just one thing," Elena whispered. The feds moved like ghosts, cleaning up the scene with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this 1,000 times. The animal attacks would be explained away as a localized rabies outbreak. The missing people would be attributed to a lone serial killer, Miller. The truth would be buried under layers of bureaucracy and need-to-know classifications. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, cold light over the carnage, the lead agent approached them. "Detective Vance, you've done some impressive work here. Work that technically doesn't exist. We're going to need your files." "And your silence." Elena looked at Silas, then back at the agent. She felt the weight of the badge in her pocket, the symbol of the system she'd served her whole life. Then she looked at the man who had stood between her and the dark. "I don't have any files," Elena said, her voice firm. "The Sarah Miller case is closed. Animal attack. Just like the coroner said." The agent narrowed his eyes, then nodded slowly. "Good. Keep it that way." When they were finally alone on the porch, the silence of the morning felt heavy. The rain had stopped, leaving the world sparkling and raw. Silas sat next to her on the top step, his shoulder touching hers. "You're a terrible liar, Elena," he said softly. "I'm a detective," she replied. "I know when to stop looking for the truth and when to start protecting it." "The DPO will watch you now," Silas warned. "See, they don't like loose ends." "Let them watch," Elena said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I've spent my life looking for monsters. Now that I've found one I actually like, I'm not going anywhere." Silas reached out, his hand covering hers. His skin was still unnaturally warm, a reminder of the fire that lived inside him. "The war isn't over, you know. Miller was just a symptom. Something is waking up in these woods, something older than the Vane line." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. The true crime chapter of her life was over. The noir was just beginning. "Then we'd better get to work," she said. "We have a lot of cold cases to solve." In the distance, the first bird began to sing, a fragile sound in a world that had almost ended. They sat there together, the human and the wolf, two predators guarding the line between the world and the dark, waiting for the next shadow to move. The mystery of Sarah Miller was solved, but the mystery of Silas Vane and the strange, magnetic pull of the night was a case Elena Vance intended to spend the rest of her life investigating. The city of Oakhaven woke up, oblivious to the blood on the hill, while its newest guardians watched the light return, knowing that the most dangerous things always come back when the sun goes down. The transition from detective to person of interest happened the moment Elena Vance stepped back into the Oakhaven precinct. The air felt thinner, the fluorescent lights harsher. Her desk, once her sanctuary of cold facts and coffee stains, now felt like an island in a sea of eyes, so she could feel the Department of Paranormal Oversight, DPO, moving in the periphery, briefcases clicking in the captain's office, the sudden maintenance of the precinct's server room. 3 days after the bloodbath at the Blackwood Estate, the summons came. It wasn't an arrest. It was an invitation to a nondescript sedan parked in the shadow of the courthouse. Inside sat Agent Miller, no relation to the boy who had lost his mind in the woods, though the name felt like a cruel joke. He was all sharp edges and clinical detachment. He didn't offer a hand. He offered a folder. "You've been a busy woman, Elena," Miller said, his voice as dry as parchment. "A 200-level clearance for a municipal detective is unheard of. But then again, so is surviving a night with Silas Vane." "I did my job," Elena replied, her hand hovering near her side, one where the bruise from the Ferrari attack was still a deep, angry purple. "We want you to keep doing it," Miller said, sliding a document across the leather seat. "Silas Vane is a variable we've tolerated because he keeps the local population in check. But the rot his brother-in-law mentioned? It's real. We believe Vane is hiding the source of a subterranean hierarchy, a prime pack that predates his lineage. We need eyes inside that house. Permanent eyes. The deal was simple and devastating. Keep her badge, keep her life, and keep the DPO from raiding the estate. Provided she reported Silas's every movement, every guest, and every shift. Elena returned to the Blackwood Estate that evening, the weight of the wire taped to her ribs feeling like a lead weight. Silas was in the garden, like the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine swirling around him. He didn't turn when she approached, but she saw his shoulders tense. "The air smells like ozone and cheap suit, Elena," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "You've been talking to the ghosts in the sedan." "They don't think you're telling the whole truth, Silas," she said, stepping closer, her heart hammering. "They think there's something under the floorboards of this town that you're protecting. Not from us, but for yourself." Silas turned then. In the twilight, his eyes weren't gold, but a deep, sorrowful amber. He walked toward her, and for a moment Elena thought he would smell the electronics, the betrayal. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, pulling her into the space between the ancient oaks, where the shadows were thickest. "There is a cavern beneath the North Ridge," Silas whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "It holds the remains of the first Alpha. If the DPO finds it, they won't just study it. They'll weaponize the blood. I'm not protecting a secret, Elena. I'm protecting a tomb that should never be opened." He pulled back, searching her face. "Now, tell me, what did they ask you to do?" Elena felt the wire burn against her skin. She realized then that she wasn't just a detective or a spy. She was the bridge between two apex predators, one with a badge and one with a bite. "They asked me to watch you," she said, her voice steadying as she made her choice. "But I think I'd rather help you bury the trail." Silas's smile was sharp, dangerous, and for the first time, truly welcoming. "Then we have work to do. The DPO is coming for the ridge at dawn, so we have 6 hours to make a mountain disappear." The Noir mystery had shifted. It was no longer about who killed Sarah Miller. It was about who would own the soul of Oakhaven. Elena Vance, the human who had looked into the dark and found a partner, checked her weapon. She wasn't just solving a case anymore. She was rewriting the law of the land. The North Ridge was a jagged spine of granite that looked like the bared teeth of the earth, choked by ancient hemlocks, and a fog so thick it felt like breathing wet wool. Elena checked the glowing digits on her watch. 4:12. The Department of Paranormal Oversight would be hitting the trailhead in less than an hour with thermal scanners and silver-jacketed containment teams. Beside her, Silas Vane was no longer the polished aristocrat in the charcoal suit. He wore heavy tactical boots and a black Henley that strained against the unnatural expansion of his chest. He wasn't shifting yet, but the air around him hummed with a low-frequency vibration that made Elena's teeth ache. "The entrance is behind the waterfall at the Devil's Throat," Silas whispered, his voice more growl than human speech. "The first Alpha's remains aren't just bone, Elena. They're a concentrated source of the primal strain. If the DPO gets their hands on a single marrow sample, they won't just oversight the packs. They'll engineer a leash for every one of my kind." "Then we don't give them a sample," Elena said, adjusting the strap of her pack. "We give them a landslide." They moved through the underbrush with a synchronized silence that surprised her. 3 weeks ago, she had been a cop following a paper trail. Now, she was an accomplice to a supernatural cover-up. As they reached the roaring curtain of the waterfall, the first drone hummed overhead, a sleek, black dragonfly with red optic sensors. "They're early," Elena hissed, pulling Silas into the shadow of a rock overhang. "They're hungry," he countered. Silas stepped into the freezing spray of the falls, guiding Elena through a narrow fissure in the rock. Inside, the cave opened into a cathedral of damp stone. In the center sat a cairn of massive boulders, etched with the same runic symbols Elena had seen at the Miller crime scene. But here, They glowed with a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat buried in the mountain. "Help me move the keystone," Silas commanded. Together they heaved a massive slab of obsidian, revealing a hollow filled with what looked like crystalline amber. Inside the amber lay a skeleton that was too large to be human, its skull crowned with elongated lupine fangs. It was beautiful and terrifying, the literal DNA of the myth. Elena pulled a brick of industrial explosive from her bag. "I'm setting the charges on the support pillars. If this roof comes down, no amount of federal digging is getting through." "Elena," Silas said, stopping her hand. He looked toward the cave entrance. The hum of the drones had been replaced by the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. "They're at the throat. If you blow this now, you're trapped in here with me. There's no back exit." "I know," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I made my choice in the car, Silas. I'm not a spy. I'm the partner of the man who keeps the monsters on a leash." The cave entrance exploded in a bloom of white phosphorus. "DPO! Drop your weapons!" Agent Miller's voice echoed through the chamber, amplified by a helmet comm. A dozen silhouettes moved through the mist, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Each one held a specialized rifle designed to drop a rhino. Elena stood in front of the cairn, her badge held high in one hand, her detonator in the other. "Agent Miller, this site is unstable," she yelled. "The seismic activity from your breach is triggering a collapse. Pull your teams back." "Nice try, Detective," Miller said, stepping forward. His face was obscured by a gas mask, making him look like a mechanical insect. "We tracked the signal from your wire. You turned it off 2 miles back. That's treason, Vance. Step away from the specimen." Silas let out a roar that shook the very stalactites above them. His body twisted, bones cracking and resetting in a violent, wet symphony of transformation. He didn't become a wolf. He became a shadow given form, a 9-foot-tall nightmare of muscle and fur that eclipsed the light of the DPO's strobes. "Fire!" Miller commanded. The cave erupted into chaos. Silver darts hissed through the air, but Silas was a blur of motion, swatting them aside with claws that tore through tactical vests like paper. Elena dove behind a rock, firing her service weapon not at the agents, but at the ceiling, trying to weaken the structural integrity. "Elena, do it!" Silas bellowed, his voice a thunderclap that resonated in her marrow. He lunged at Miller, pinning the agent against the cave wall. Silas didn't kill him. He simply crushed the agent's weapon and stared into his goggles, with eyes that burned like twin suns. And he was showing them the difference between a government asset and a god of the woods. Elena looked at the detonator. One thumb press and her career, her life in the sunlight, and the secret of the first Alpha would be buried forever. "I'm sorry, Captain," she whispered to the empty air, thinking of the precinct she'd never return to. She pressed the button. The world turned into sound and dust. The charges blew with a synchronized thump that collapsed the entrance and the ceiling in a cascading roar of granite. Elena felt a massive, warm weight wrap around her, Silas using his own indestructible body as a shield as the mountain fell. Silence followed, deep, heavy, and absolute. Minutes, or maybe hours later, Elena opened her eyes. The cave was gone, replaced by a narrow pocket of space beneath a lean-to of fallen boulders. Yes, it was pitch black, save for the faint golden glow of Silas's eyes. He was hunched over her, his fur matted with stone dust, his breathing heavy and labored. "Did we?" She coughed, her lungs burning. "The tomb is sealed," Silas rasped. He shifted back into his human form, his skin cold to the touch. "The DPO will think we're dead. They'll spend months drilling, but by then, the energy of the cairn will have dissipated. The strain is safe." "We're trapped, Silas," she said, reaching out to find his hand in the dark. "For now," he said, a hint of his old, arrogant smirk in his voice. "But you forget, Detective. I've spent centuries learning how to move through the earth. And you're far too stubborn to die in a hole." He began to dig, his hands moving with a strength that defied physics. As a sliver of moonlight finally pierced through a gap in the rubble, Elena realized that the true crime story hadn't just ended. It had evolved. She wasn't a cop anymore, and she wasn't just a survivor. She was something the DPO couldn't categorize. They climbed out onto the ridge, looking down at the valley where the lights of Oakhaven twinkled, unaware of the war that had just been buried. "What now?" Elena asked, looking at her dusty, blood-stained hands. Silas looked toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed into the sky. "Now, we go to ground. We build a new pack, one that doesn't hide in the shadows, but owns them." Elena Vance took a breath of the cold, morning air. The slow burn was over. The fire had consumed everything she used to be, but as she looked at Silas Vane, she realized she liked the ashes just fine.